Welcome to a PreventConnect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Hi everyone, this is Tori Vandeland with PreventConnect. This podcast is part 3 of our 3-part conversation with Dr. Zoe Peterson. On the first 2 episodes, we talked about research on perpetration and perpetration prevention, its challenges, the challenges with shared and unshared language, and being able to identify perpetration. On this last podcast, we bring it all together and talk about the implications for prevention, and specifically how sexuality education and sex positivity can be really useful in this area and play a huge role in shaping community norms from a young age and beyond. We'll also talk a little bit too about the future of research and practice in the Meto era. So that's all really interesting when we are examining the language that we use, and I think if you're seeing these impacts in a research setting, then I would anticipate that there's also those impacts in the field in prevention messaging too. So how might this kind of language identifying disconnect affect prevention messaging, and what prevention strategies would you recommend for changing language and reaching either resistant groups or just folks who don't identify sexually violent behavior as violent?
Yes, so I think this is so hard, and in truth, when it comes to reaching resistant groups, the answer is I don't know, and so I'm like, I have like some vague ideas, but they are untried, and I think this is the huge challenge with this, that probably the people who very most need the prevention are the people who are going to be most resistant, both to participating in it and to hearing the messages that are in it, because for those individuals, the messages are threatening and accusatory. So I think there's some really good things about what bystander interventions do, and some of those potentially, I think, can be adapted. So I think, one thing is talking about these behaviors and potentially in relation to other people is perhaps less threatening. And also, I think, really talking about the range of behaviors and talking about sort of coercion, and I don't even know, maybe not even using that word, but this sort of attempts to convince, to seduce, I don't know, maybe those are better words, people into sex without sort of talking about explicit rape, because even individuals in our interviews who had done something that would probably legally qualify as rape, they thought about it as sort of convincing her, getting around her no. They didn't think about it as literally being rape or being non-consensual. And so I think to the extent, and I think bystander interventions do a good job of this, of really talking about the entire range of behaviors and kind of trying to move the bar around what's acceptable, that it's not these illegal acts that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. We all are unacceptable, even if people are still doing them. We do all know they're unacceptable, but kind of moving the bar towards, really treating persistent, coercive kinds of things as also unacceptable. Mm-hmm. But then also, I think the other piece is that, and this is sort of what we're trying to get at around the sex positive intervention, that in some ways this is a bigger problem, that this is really about kind of sexual norms, about people's, lack of kind of messages about healthy sexuality from very early ages. So, I think we tried in our pilot study to do this sex positive education with college students, with the idea that, maybe this would invoke less defensiveness, and because many of these individuals didn't have basic information about healthy sexuality. Mm-hmm. But I do believe, I don't think it's hopeless to intervene around college students, but I think it is certainly too late. The much ideal place to intervene would be much earlier, and that, that we should start at really young ages talking about, and I think there's some movement towards this, talking about boundaries and bodily autonomy and respect, and that we should give people sort of good information about sexual anatomy, sexual physiology, what healthy sex looks like, and what it might feel like, and all of those things well before they get into college, because I think, really by the time they're in college, in many cases, we're trying to change pre-existing patterns, and we're talking about rape prevention with individuals in some cases who have already perpetrated rape. And so I think that makes it especially hard for individuals to hear those messages and think about changing, because it's already sort of part of their repertoire, sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that starting prevention at a young age, especially from that framework of healthy sexuality and bodily autonomy and communication and pleasure, is so important, not just for sexual violence prevention, but then my mind is also going, I have a master's of public health degree, so I'm thinking of unintended pregnancy prevention and disease and infection prevention and things like that, but also how great would it be if folks from a young age are steeped in this culture of acceptance and respect, so that way, folks who are LGBTQIA+, they are represented in their healthy sexuality information and are validated and feel like they're welcome and normal, and folks of differing abilities are also included in that conversation. So I feel like when folks get the sex positivity and healthy sexuality stuff right and inclusive, it can go miles, not just for preventing sexual violence and intimate partner violence, but preventing discrimination and other forms of violence too. And I really liked how you brought up the strengths of bystander intervention and how that can play into these other violence prevention strategies we have too, with looking at it in relation to others too. I think that goes back to how we create that community norm. It's not just one perpetrator in a community that's the issue. It's the community that allows it to continue happening, or that silences survivors, that also have a role to play in reversing that norm and moving it towards prevention. And also displaying that range of behaviors too, especially when your research is telling you that if folks aren't able to identify their behavior as violent or potentially violent, then we need to be including those behaviors in our examples about what is sexually violent behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, wow. I think you just made lots of really good points. I mean, I think, so I think, I do think we need to treat it and talk about it more as a cultural problem, because that reduces defensiveness. It's not a bad individual. It's a problem that we all have to change. And again, I think a really nice thing that bystander interventions teach. And I think that also that kind of focus on sort of personality traits as a risk factor really does make it about these sort of individual bad guys, these kind of monsters that are going out there, and I think sort of paints this picture that the only way to prevent sexual assault is to, like, I don't know, I guess round these guys up and put them in jail, and then everyone will be fine. And I think that's probably not realistic for all kinds of reasons, but also really kind of demonizes in perpetrators in a way that's probably not going to be helpful for promoting change. I also just wanted to go back to your point about, sort of good sex positive, comprehensive sex education, maybe being particularly important for LGBT individuals. And I think that's actually really important when we talk about sexual assault, because our prevention efforts around sexual assault tend to be so heterosexist. So tend to, and I'm even doing it today in this discussion because this is kind of how the research is focused, that we talk about women as victims and men as perpetrators. And actually, gay and bisexual men and especially bisexual women are at extremely high risk of sexual assault. And so many of our models of prevention don't fully address those individuals. And I think in part also, individuals who identify as LGBT have especially been left out of sex education. So they have even less education about healthy sexuality for them than people who identify as heterosexual. And so, one way to sort of address that inconsistency would be better general sex education that is more inclusive.
Absolutely. I am all for that and super excited for a future where that's a reality for everyone. And so I can't wait to see that happen. I think we've already kind of discussed my next question, which was going to be on the role that sexual health education plays in preventing perpetration. So if it's okay with you, I think I'm just going to continue this conversation that we're already on and ask, how else can sexual health education shape community norms around violence prevention?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think, I think I can imagine this sort of utopian world where everyone grew up with this, sort of great, comprehensive, sex-positive sex education. And I think, wow, I mean, that would have so many potential impacts. I mean, I think everyone would have sort of a sense of respectful versus disrespectful sexual interactions, and probably be a lot more likely to intervene around sort of lower level violations of people's boundaries and sort of lower level kind of disrespectful comments and touch that might then prevent the sort of higher level things from happening. I think certainly people would be more empathic and willing to believe people who talked about their bad experiences, because I think in part sometimes the reason that victims are blamed or not believed is that people don't have these kind of clear pictures of what does really consensual, pleasurable sex look like. And so because people don't sort of have that model, they think, oh, well, what they're describing sounds like, some of my experiences. And so that can't really be a problem because we don't have this image of like what is really good sex. So when people say I've had this bad experience, there's not this kind of ability to distinguish between those things. So I can imagine that people would be much more willing to believe and support victims who came forward, which would then, I think, again, help to sort of undermine some of those rape myths and victim blaming kinds of attitudes that contribute to the problem of sexual violence.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you just brought up the listening to and believing survivors part of the community norms and the social norms that we're trying to promote, and how that plays into violence prevention too. I think that leads really well into our next question about, we've seen these conversations around sexual and intimate partner violence shift a lot, especially since the #MeToo hashtag took off in 2017. And we all know that the #MeToo movement has been around much longer, from Tarana Burke. So, and I know that you also do additional research on sexual consent, sexual communication, decision-making, and gender differences between all of those. So how has the #MeToo movement and the way that the national conversation around sexual and intimate partner violence, how that #MeToo era that we're living in now has impacted your research, and what implications do you see this having on future research in prevention and on our prevention practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's hard to say for sure. So I can say that, I mean, I think the #MeToo movement has been really dramatic. The #MeToo movement, and actually even a little before the #MeToo movement, there was this kind of burst of attention on campus sexual assault, I think, starting kind of with the Obama administration's kind of work around that issue. And so there was a lot of media attention on campus sexual assault, and then there was this kind of attention on the #MeToo movement. And I think as a result of those factors, there really is, I sense in both in my research participants and just in my sort of daily conversations, that there's a much greater understanding of the extent of the problem, of what really the sort of most typical instances of sexual assault and sexual harassment look like. I think, there used to even fairly recently be kind of these stereotypes that sexual assault was the stranger who jumped out of the bushes, and I think that really has changed. I feel that has changed. I don't have necessarily data. And certainly, those of us who have done sexual assault research for many years before this shift, had all these kind of facts about the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual harassment. But I think there's something very different about within the Me Too movement, all these women that people know telling their stories that I think makes those statistics more believable. I think it was, a sort of hidden problem before, and I think people heard those statistics and sort of believed them, but they maybe didn't fully ring true, because you hear something like, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 college women experience sexual assault, and people think, well, I didn't know women who experienced sexual assault in college, so that doesn't feel right. And I think the Me Too movement has helped people kind of become aware that is true, and that they were maybe didn't know many people who had these experiences. So I think it's been really valuable in that way. And I think as a result, my sense is that the research on sexual assault and sexual harassment and other kinds of sexual violence has maybe been increasing. And I certainly am aware that there's a lot of, brand new students, graduate students, who are really interested in this topic. So I think my hope is that this will lead to a lot more research on this topic, and that will be really helpful in informing prevention. But I think I feel like it's a little early to say, like, how exactly it's gonna influence things.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel like we're feeling the shift in the field, and I think that's so great to hear that there is a new generation of super eager new researchers too. Whether or not your graduate students choose to continue on with research or go into the field, but as someone who's also recently out of graduate school, that was something that I felt in my program too. And it's nice to hear that it's not just my program that was experiencing that there is an empowered generation. There is an empowered generation that is coming out of this movement with a hunger for solutions.
Yes, I think that really is true. And I think we'll go on to be great researchers, but also to be advocates and therapists who treat survivors and all of those kinds of things in a way that will look different than when I was first starting in the field.
Yeah, definitely. So, Zoe, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. That concludes all the questions that I had for you, but I want to give you a moment. If there's anything else that you want to share with our PreventConnect audience, I want to give you some time and space to do that.
I don't think so. I think that covers everything, but it's been a pleasure to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this PreventConnect podcast. PreventConnect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on PreventConnect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about PreventConnect, visit www.PreventConnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.